Back in June, when the team ran webinars on workforce planning and an update on the job retention scheme, we started to plan this workshop. We knew in advance of the job retention scheme coming to an end that we were going to see a significant increase in redundancies this autumn. Figures this week from the Institute for Employment Studies say UK employers are planning more than twice as many redundancies than they did at the height of the last recession. And social distancing measures to prevent the spread of COVID since March have brought large parts of the UK economy to a standstill, forcing workers to stay at home, closing shops and bringing transport to a halt over the period. As a result, many businesses have been forced to consider reducing their workforces, and by many making employees redundant. About 180,000 job cuts were planned from January to March 2009, while 380,000 were planned from May to July 2020. Completed redundancies could reach 735,000 people this autumn. With that backdrop, our employer advisory team are going to walk you through key considerations for redundancy. Fiona Doctor, our HR Director, will discuss how to navigate the redundancy process to ensure it is fair and compliant. This will be mainly looking at redundancies of less than 20 people, but Fiona will also touch on collective redundancies of 20 or more too. Avril Craig, our payroll manager, will cover statutory redundancy based on age and length of service, enhanced redundancy pay, and if that's included in staff contracts, notice pay and how it is calculated, managing holiday pay when staff are leaving, and we'll go into a bit of detail on how to calculate a week's pay for the redundancy process, which can be less than straightforward if staff are on furlough and normally work variable hours. Louise Mackie, our tax manager, will look at the tax implications of types of termination payments. She'll look at contractual and non-contractual payments and payments up to the £30,000 tax-free threshold. She'll also look at how these payments interact with the furlough claims. As with our previous webinars, there'll be a live Q&A session after our three speakers have presented to you. If there are others in your organisation who you were hoping would be able to see this webinar, we are recording this for you as well, so that you can share it with your colleagues. We've received some questions from you in advance, and you'll also be able to type questions in using the chat function on the right-hand toolbar. There's a Q&A function there, so if you look for that, as our three speakers raise points, if that raises questions with you, do type them in and we'll pick them up at the end of the webinar. As we said in the invitation, anything you post will be anonymous and only myself and our speakers will be able to see your questions. So over to Fiona.
With the winding down of the job retention scheme and the 31st of October looming, many employers unfortunately may now be faced with having to make some of their workforce redundant. Redundancies should always be a last resort and only commenced after all other options have been considered. Given the potential for costly employment tribunal claims, it is important that employers follow a fair redundancy process to mitigate risk. I'm going to talk you through the steps and the factors you need to consider as you navigate your way through a fair redundancy process, and I have broken this into 5 sections. The first is, what is a genuine redundancy situation? The planning stage, your selection pool and selection process, the individual consultation process, and I'll finish by looking at suitable alternative employment and time off to attend interviews. So what is a genuine redundancy situation? Redundancies are often looked at as a way of reducing numbers of employees. However, the legal definition relates to job roles and not people. For there to be a genuine redundancy situation, there needs to be a business closure, a closure of a particular workplace, or a reduced need for employees carrying out particular work. The planning stage. Prior to commencing any redundancy consultation, it is important to create a business case to help plan the process. It does not need to be long, but should detail the reasons for the redundancies, which part of the business will be affected, the anticipated impact on the business, including numbers involved, the business rationale for the selection pool, and timescales, as well as actions taken to avoid redundancies, such as cutting pay, implementing pay freezes, cutting overtime, short-time working, redeployment or recruitment freezes, and of course use of the furlough scheme, which was certainly a viable option in the early part of lockdown. I tend to use this document to create the script, which will be used to notify employees of the potential redundancy proposal, and also throughout the process to ensure the message is consistent from the start. In addition, a business case can help employers evidence that a redundancy was not used as a way to cover up other employee issues. Other factors employers should consider at the planning stage are consultation timescales, the selection method, alternative roles, and the financial impact to the business. An important stage as part of the planning process is to identify the pool of employees who are at risk of redundancy and the appropriate selection methods. The selection pool is identified by looking at what type of work is ceasing or diminishing, which employees carry out this work, do similar work, or have interchangeable roles, and whether there is an agreed pool with either a union or employee representative group. Employers do have a considerable freedom to define the pool selection in a manner which works for them, provided that it falls within the range of reasonable responses of an employer and they can justify their decisions. It is up to employers to determine the most appropriate selection process. This could include seeking volunteers, scoring the pool on agreed selection criteria, or through an interview process. The most common approach is assessing employees against set criteria. When using selection criteria, employers must consult with employees or any representatives if they are in place, but there is no requirement to agree on the criteria used. Ultimately, it is up to the employer to choose selection criteria that will enable them to retain the workforce with the skills they need going forward. Often employees will argue that particular skills or attributes should be taken into consideration, but these may not be important to the future of the business. The most common selection criteria used are skills and competencies, absence levels, although you must discount any leave which may be deemed discriminatory, technical expertise, experience needed for a new role, qualifications, timekeeping, disciplinary warnings and records, although spent warnings should be excluded. Last in, first out is rarely used because this could discriminate against younger employees or female employees. As far as possible, employers should choose objective criteria which they can verify by reference to data such as appraisals, training records or timekeeping records. When scoring employees against the agreed criteria, ensure that more than one person conducts the assessment or the original marker scores are moderated by someone else to remove suggestion of personal bias and to double check all calculations. Employees should be made aware of their own personal scoring or markings in the assessment process. Employers are not required to show an employee everyone else's scores, although they need to see sufficient information to know that the system has been fairly applied to them. And this information should be given at least 24 hours before any consultation meeting takes place. It is worth noting that if a business is proposing to select staff for redundancy based purely on the fact that they are furloughed, there is a risk that this approach may give rise to an unfair or even discrimination claim. The extent of the risk will depend on the reasons for staff having been placed on furlough in the first place and the selection process that was used to do this. For example, if staff have been put on furlough because they have caring responsibilities or were perhaps shielding for health reasons, subsequently pooling and or selecting these employees for redundancy is likely to constitute indirect discrimination based on sex, disability or age. It is therefore important to reassess the fairness of pools and selection criteria and consult staff about this at the point that redundancies become necessary to ensure any redundancies are not substantively or procedurally unfair. So if we turn to the consultation process now. The consultation process employers need to follow depends on how many redundancies are proposed at one establishment. We are concentrating on individual consultation for employers who are carrying out less than 20 redundancies proposed within a 90-day period. It is worth noting, however, that collective dismissals of 20 or more employees are covered by specific statutory procedures and timescales. When an employer wishes to make 20 or more employees at one establishment redundant within a 90-day period, the employer is also under a statutory obligation to consult representatives of the affected employees. In these cases, there is still an obligation to consult individually as well. I would recommend anyone contemplating making 20 or more employees redundant read the ACAS guidance handling large-scale redundancies prior to commencing any redundancy exercise. Individual redundancy consultation should start in good time and allow for meaningful consultation. Fair consultation involves giving the affected employees a fair and proper opportunity to fully understand and consider the matters they are being consulted on, and to discuss any concerns or express their views. Employers must be willing to take on board their representations and perhaps amend their proposals to show that they have done so. Ultimately, they are not required to accept any suggestions made by employees, but evidence that employee concerns have been addressed will always assist employers in any employment tribunal proceedings that are subsequently brought. It is important to ensure that anyone absent on holiday, sick leave or any other forms of leave are equally informed about the announcement and have a full opportunity to participate in the consultation. Consultation can also be started with employees whilst they are on furlough leave. Any normal redundancy procedures should be followed but adapted to allow for social distancing. Zoom or team calls would be an example of this. Although the precise number of consultation meetings will vary from one redundancy situation to another, there will at least be a first meeting, usually with all the employees potentially at risk of redundancy, to explain the background, set out the proposals and seek views on the preferred selection methods, and to establish whether the employees have any alternative suggestions to avoid redundancy. Assuming nothing changes, the next step would be to apply the agreed selection method and continue individual consultations with those who have been provisionally selected for redundancy. The number of meetings that follow would be dependent upon points raised as part of the consultation, but generally 1 or 2, with a final meeting at which the employer summarises discussions, confirms that the employee is to be made redundant, as well as the dismissal date and payments. The employee should also be given the right of appeal. It is important that all discussions and meeting outcomes are documented. You may need to rely on this in the future if any of your employees challenge your decisions. An employee does not have an absolute legal right to be accompanied to the redundancy consultation meetings, but the best advice is to allow the request for a companion for those employees who wish to be accompanied. Employees do, however, have the right to be accompanied at the final meeting when termination of employment is being considered. Moving on to suitable alternative employment. As part of the consultation process and up to the effective termination date, employers have a duty to seek to identify suitable alternative employment opportunities for redundant employees, and employees have a right to a 4-week trial period in the new job. In terms of time off to look for new work or undergo training, once employees with more than 2 years service have been issued with a dismissal notice, they have the right to reasonable time off with pay to look for new work or to undergo training for future employment, and these requests should not be unreasonably refused. The entitlement to such pay throughout the notice period is capped at 2/5 of 1 week's actual pay. Redundancy can be a complex matter, and you should seek appropriate advice before proceeding with the redundancy exercise. ACAS have a telephone helpline and have recently issued a redundancy procedure flow chart which can help you navigate through the process. I appreciate I have covered a lot of content, so I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at the Q&A. And I'm now going to hand you over to Avril.
Thank you, Fiona, and hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about redundancy pay and how it's calculated, notice pay and how that's calculated, and holiday pay when an employee leaves, what you have to think about, and also what actually constitutes a week's pay. So starting off with redundancy pay and how we calculate that. Every employee who has at least 2 years continuous service is entitled to statutory redundancy payments. The amount that's payable to them depends on several factors. It depends on the employee's age, it depends on their length of service and their weekly pay. There's a statutory maximum limit on the week's pay when you're calculating statutory redundancy pay, and that's currently £538 per week. So if you're making an employee redundant whose pay is £650 a week, the maximum due for statutory redundancy pay is £538 per week. Now there's a useful redundancy calculator on the gov.uk website, and we're going to share a link to that calculator with you now. So employees who are aged between 18 and 22, they're entitled to receive half a week's pay for each complete year service. If your employees are aged between 22 and 40 years of age, they're entitled to receive 1 week's redundancy pay for each complete year of service. And employees aged 41 years and older are entitled to receive 1.5 weeks redundancy pay. Now, please note this higher rate of 1.5 weeks only applies from the time the employee has reached 41 years of age. So, for example, a person aged 47 with 10 years service will be paid 1 week's redundancy pay for each of the first 4 years, and then thereafter he'll receive 1.5 weeks redundancy pay for the remaining 6 years when he was aged between 42 and 47. So that's how statutory redundancy pay works. And I'd like to move on to enhanced redundancy pay, because some employers operate an enhanced scheme where they pay their employees over and above the statutory entitlements. They've decided to offer a more generous package. Now, this is a decision and it's up to the employer to decide if they want to enhance redundancy pay. And in most organisations, this is set out in the company handbook and it's in the employee's contract. So if you're considering an enhanced payment on a discretionary basis, maybe you've not already got this in your contracts. If you're considering that for one group of individuals or one employee, then I really strongly recommend that you seek professional advice, as it's very, very easy for this decision to go wrong. So in any case, whether we're talking about statutory redundancy or enhanced redundancy, this pay is not subject to deduction of PAYE, NIC or pension contributions up to a limit of £30,000. My colleague Louise is going to tell you a little bit more about that. So moving on, that was redundancy pay, both statutory and enhanced. And moving on to notice pay and how we calculate that. All employees are entitled to receive paid notice of their redundancy. And again, this is determined by the length of their service. But unlike redundancy pay, there's no cap on the weekly amount and there's no age-related multiplier. The amount of statutory notice payable is employees who have between 1 month and 2 years of service, they get 1 week's pay for each full year of employment. If they've got 2 years or more service, they'll get a week's pay for each full year of service, up to a maximum of 12 weeks. However, if there's an entitlement to contractual notice, which is the same or more than the statutory notice, the contractual notice applies. Now, there's a really important note about contractual notice pay. Employees who are made redundant whilst they're on furlough are entitled to notice of termination in accordance with their contracts. The government have confirmed that statutory notice pay during the notice period is payable at the rate of the employee's full contractual normal salary, not the wage they've been receiving under the furlough scheme. And after some complex legal arguments, new rules came into play, and actually these new rules permit employers to pay a lower rate for contractual notice periods, only as long as these notice periods are at least 1 week longer than the statutory minimum period. The notice period starts when the employee is formally provided with notice of their redundancy. Some employers prefer to pay all notice pay at once and the job ends straight away. This is called pay in lieu of notice. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated to PILON, P-I-L-O-N. Some employers prefer their employees to remain employed during the notice period. The employee might be furloughed whilst on notice, and again my colleague Louise is going to tell you a little bit more about how notice and furlough pay work together. So if you've got an employee who's working as normal, they may work their notice period, or they may be given garden leave, whereby they're paid for the duration of the period of notice, so that's every week or every month, but they're not required to attend work for the duration of the notice. So you can see there are several options here and lots to think about. However notice pay is paid, it is subject to deductions of PAYE, NIC, student loan and pension contributions. So we've covered redundancy pay and notice pay. When an employee leaves you, you also have to think about holiday pay. Now, every employee accrues holiday pay each week that they're employed, and on leaving, for whatever reason they're leaving, redundancy or otherwise, they're entitled to be paid for any holidays they've accrued. This payment of holiday pay is subject to PAYE and NIC. Now, actually, with careful planning, it's possible to require your employees to take holidays during their notice period. Again, this is something that I recommend that you obtain professional advice on if you're thinking of going down that route. Earlier on, I mentioned a week's pay. I've mentioned this several times actually, so it's vital to be clear what constitutes a week's pay for the purpose of redundancy, notice and holiday pay, because it's not always the same. If your employee works fixed hours, is on a fixed salary, then this calculation is actually pretty straightforward. But it can become complicated where the employee works varied hours, gets shift allowance, guaranteed overtime, etc., or where they're furloughed. So, where the pay is variable, redundancy pay is worked out on a 12-week average, the 12 weeks prior to furlough, and it's payable at the full contractual rate, not the historic rate. Where the employee has perhaps not worked for a week, that week is skipped for the average calculation, and a further week back should be counted, so a week with no hours won't bring down the average weekly amount of hours. When calculating holiday pay for variable paid employees, holiday pay is calculated on a 52-week average now. Again, this is weeks prior to furlough. We can't use furlough pay to calculate holiday pay. It has to be weeks when the employee was working. When it comes to notice pay, notice is paid at the full contractual rate, unless, as mentioned earlier, a contractual notice period longer than the statutory minimum notice period allows you to pay notice pay at the furlough rate. So, as you can see, these calculations can become rather complex. And again, it's vital to get this right, and I would strongly recommend that you seek professional help on this matter. Now I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Louise Mackie, who will tell you a bit more about taxation and termination payments.
Thanks, Avril. So I thought it'd be helpful to follow on from what Avril was saying about how the tax implications, PAYE obligations, fall into those types of payments. So termination payments are either fully taxable, partially taxable, or fully exempt. So the PAYE due on each type of payment really depends on the nature of the payment itself. So termination payments are considered earnings of the employment and are taxed in the normal way if they are payments in respect of services performed under an employment contract, due to a clause within the employment contract that states that the employee has a legal right to receive a termination payment, and also if the employment contract does not mention any comment on the termination payments, however the employee has a reasonable expectation that they would receive a payment, HMRC in this case would look to see what has historically been done by the employer to see if other employees have received a payment in a similar situation, and would then seek to tax, if appropriate, that payment. However, termination payments that are non-contractual and are completely voluntarily paid by the employer are considered under a different part of the legislation. These types of payments would be non-contractual, ex grata, thank you type payments that are paid on an entirely voluntary basis and without any employer obligation. How these types of payments are taxed depends on the reasons for the payment. So where the termination payment is made on the death of an employee, or where the contract has been terminated due to a physical or psychological nature that is sufficient enough to say that the employee is no longer able to perform their duties, the payment is fully exempt from tax. Where the payment is made into the employee's registered pension scheme rather than to them directly, which is a good tax planning point and is commonly used, the payment is also fully exempt from PAYE. So all other non-contractual voluntary payments that fall into this category are only taxed to the extent that they exceed £30,000. So the first 30,000 of these types of payments can be paid tax and NIC free. Now it's important that the £30,000 threshold covers all redundancy payments that are both statutory and non-statutory under employment law. Now, wherever a termination payment is made before the end of the contractual notice period, so the employee is receiving the payment that's a payment in lieu of notice, this payment needs to be divided into two categories in order to establish how the payment is to be taxed. So the first one to look at is whether it is a post-employment notice pay period, which may be covered by the £30,000 threshold, and the other half of the calculation is any amounts which are not post-employment notice pay. So these are again taxed under normal employment law rules and are liable to PAYE. So it's quite important when you're looking at the types of payment that you're going to make is establish at the start whether they're contractual or non-contractual. Now, what there is at the moment is there's an interaction between the payments that you can make and the furlough scheme. So if an employee is working their notice period, you can claim for any furloughed hours during that period. So a claim can then be made in regards to the amounts that are in force at time under the scheme rules. So at the moment you could claim back 70% of the furloughed time under the scheme. What really is important though to pay attention to is that you cannot make any furlough claims against the amounts that are paid in regards to payments in lieu of notice. Because they're not actually working anything, then they're not entitled to make that claim. I think it's also important that I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about where the furlough scheme is at this moment in time. So from the 1st of September, you're now able to claim back only 70% of the furloughed wage. From the 1st of October, that will reduce down to 60%, which will then see the scheme come to a close on the 31st of October. What HMRC have announced is that they will offer a £1,000 bonus payment to the employer per employee, but yet no payment date for when this will be received or how it will be paid or claimed has been released by HMRC. So every qualifying furlough employee that you've had, so they would have had to have qualified before the 30th of June. So if they've been on the scheme at any point from when it started and they're continuously employed by you until the 31st of January next year, and where they earn at least £520 a month on average between the 1st of November to the 31st of January, you'll be able to claim this bonus for them. And as I say, that is per employee, and once we know some more details, we will release these to you so that you have them. So I think I'll hand back to David, I think. Is it David?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks Fiona for your insight into the importance of following a fair redundancy process. And thanks to Avril and Louise for looking at the impact on contractual and non-contractual payments, the furlough payments and the tax implications. You know, just listening to the three speakers, a real depth to things you need to consider to suit your individual and specific situations, and what Avril said a few times, you really need, I think, to seek advice where appropriate. As I said at the start, we will now have a live Q&A session with the opportunity for you to ask our team questions. So do keep your questions coming in. I'll start sharing them with the team. As I said, we've had a few questions from you in advance. If you post very specific questions, we may need to come back to you individually, and you may think that you want to contact us offline with specifics for your situation too. So all these things are possible. So just looking at the first questions that we have. This one, Avril, I think you may have covered this to some degree in your presentation, but if you're planning to make someone redundant, can you claim the notice through the furlough scheme?
You can do that as long as they aren't being paid pay in lieu of notice, as long as they remain in your employment and on furlough during that notice period.
Fiona, one for you. Our managers have never been trained in redundancy, and there are many fears on being involved in the process. Is it acceptable for HR to take the lead? Definitely one for you, Fiona.
Redundancy processes can be very difficult and scary for both the employer and the employee, particularly if the employees have been with the business for a long time. Ultimately, the line manager knows their team members and are much better placed to make informed decisions on things like selection criteria, the selection process, and what is best for the future success of their department, as well as assessing the financial viability of any alternative suggestions put forward by the employees. HR should be there to guide and support the line manager and the employees through the process. The types of support I'm thinking about in terms of supporting the line manager may be training prior to the commencement of any redundancy programme, input into the planning stage, attendance at the meetings, preparation of meeting checklists, minute taking and preparing documentation, as well as procedural advice. This can also help the line managers, or they can also help line managers offer job search and interview technique training for any employee losing their job. So I think it's certainly my view that for the morale of both the affected employees and the engagement of surviving employees, it's better that the line manager is seen to be handling the redundancy process fairly and sensitively.
Thanks, Fiona. I think in my experience over the last 28 years of being in business, that's something I would concur with, just when I've seen it with our clients too. Much better for the line manager to lead the process, but if support is needed from HR, that would be the way that I would certainly recommend that you do it. Got another question here, Avril, if you want to pick this one up. We have employees on furlough throughout their notice period, and we have chosen to top them up to 100% salary for this period. Was that essential, or could we have continued to pay 80%?
So the answer is you have to pay them at 100% of their pay for notice period, and presuming that the employees in question have been paid the statutory notice period, in which case it's absolutely yes, it's vital that it's 100%. I did mention earlier that if there's an arrangement for contractual notice, which is a bit longer than the statutory notice, potentially you could pay them at the lower amount. But I'm guessing in this case, we're talking about people on statutory notice, in which case, yes, they have to be paid at 100% of their pay.
Thanks, Avril, appreciate that. Just checking, there's no more questions coming in, so I've got one more, which I think again is for Fiona. So sorry, Louise, there's been no tax-related ones for yet. But if there's anything else that you want to share, Louise, you can maybe come in after Fiona here. So Fiona, what do I need to consider if I offer voluntary redundancy?
It can be useful for employers to reduce compulsory redundancies by accepting volunteers. This can have the advantage of allowing those who want to leave to do so, and it can be more palatable to employees and shorten the inevitable period of instability. However, employers should avoid committing to accepting every request, as they risk losing those with skills they want to retain. They should also consider how they will choose between the individuals applying for a voluntary redundancy, should there be more people come forward than required. So in other words, the selection criteria. And it's also worth noting that for employees to take this option seriously, there may be an expectation of an enhanced redundancy payment, which employers may not be able to afford at this time.
Thanks, Fiona. I think it's a very sensitive subject that we're covering in today's webinar. So if any of you do have questions that you want to take offline, then please do contact us after the webinar, and we'd be happy to support you with any questions or support that you need. So I'm just going to wrap up. I've got definitely no more questions that have come through, so I'm just going to wrap up then for the webinar with some thank yous. Thank you to Fiona, Avril and Louise for your real in-depth insights today. Thank you for the technical support and for the nudges offline to make me unmute. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon out your busy schedules. Please stay safe and best wishes for your future plans. Bye now.